Mutual Broadcasting System presents STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. With today's briefing, here is retired Marine Intelligence Officer LtCol Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT and our Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. In this episode, it's going to talk about some of the big changes that are happening in the, for lack of a better term, war in Iran or war with Iran. And not only things that are more dangerous for, of course, everybody directly involved in the conflict, but also some stuff, especially that's dangerous for Iran and is dangerous for the Gulf states, but portends a widening of the conflict, but a significant change in the conflict. And so I'll get into that. Just a lot of stuff that's been going on, and a lot of stuff that's been going on that's just really changed very recently. The U.S. has begun targeting bridges, power plants, critical infrastructure in Iran. Certainly, there are some out there saying this is a violation of the law of war, or it's an international war crime, or something like that. These are all what we call dual use. All right, a bridge can be a bridge for many different people. When the military can go across a bridge, and civilians can go across a bridge, but the bridge is a bridge, and there's nothing that makes a bridge an intrinsically civilian thing unless it's solely for civilian traffic. So when you talk about bridges, rail lines, stuff like that, if you go back to World War II, that's pretty much what all the resistance folks did, was blow up bridges and rail lines and things along that line. So anyway, long story short, these are not war crimes, all right? But we've begun hitting a lot of these things. Iran has begun targeting critical infrastructure in the Gulf states as well. Most notably, we've hit a power plant, but they've also hit at least one or more power plants, and they hit a desalination plant in Kuwait. Now, a quick geographic note, I've probably mentioned this before. If you go to Kuwait or to the island nation of Bahrain or to any of these countries, you don't see big freshwater rivers feeding into these big cities, which is a desert. And you see a big city kind of rising out of the sand, so to speak. These are major metropolises. They have a lot of high-rises. They have a lot of very impressive skylines, but they are dependent on certain things, and you can't have a large, dense urban population without a lot of fresh water. That's how humans survive. And so if you look at what they have to do in that regard, it's rather dramatic, particularly in terms of using seawater, which there's plenty in the Persian Gulf, and desalinating it and turning it into potable fresh water. So Kuwait City, for example, someplace I know quite well, I used to be stationed right near there, went into Kuwait City on a regular basis. Kuwait City gets about 90% of its fresh water from desalination. My recollection is about 8, I may be 1 or 2 off, 8 desalination plants along the coast. That makes sense, considering where the water's coming from. But they're right there. They're vulnerable. Manama, the capital of the island nation of Bahrain, obviously there's no rivers that go off to an island nation in the Persian Gulf. They get pretty much almost all of their fresh water from desalination, so they're very dependent on desalination. And then if you go down to Dubai, you got Abu Dhabi, Dubai, but Dubai, for example, this major metropolitan area in the United Arab Emirates, they get about 80% of their potable water from desalination. Now, you're saying, why only 80%, not 90% or all? And I would say because if you look at the terrain there, different types of terrain. It's not just a low-lying island in the Persian Gulf, and it's not Kuwait, which is, yes, there's a little rise there, but there's no mountains. If you go to UAE, there are actual mountains. There's some serious mountains, hills around there. With that, when you get rain, that's a catchment thing where the water will flow downhill into little streams and rivers where it can eventually soak into the water table, or it can flow into some place where it can be basically stored. Anyway, long story short, there are other sources of fresh water in the UAE that you don't have in every location throughout the Persian Gulf region. All right. But with that said, 80% of the water for Dubai, for example, comes from desalination. All right. None of these desalination plants were designed with the idea, hey, we're going to get attacked by ballistic missiles and drones. That was not a design criteria. And so they're all fairly vulnerable to attack. And despite all the air defense stuff that's out there, let's recognize that these are vulnerable should drones or missiles come in and hit them. And now Iranian drones and missiles are coming in and aiming specifically for them. All right. So very vulnerable to attack. Similarly, since all these plants rely on seawater, you're going to find them all very proximate to the Persian Gulf. So they don't have to fly very far inland in order to hit this stuff. So that means they're even more vulnerable because a lot of the intercept stuff you'd see as they get further into the country, it's just not a consideration because they don't have to get further into the country because those plants are right there. Anyway, that's enough about desalination, but I just want to mention that. The big concern, and you probably heard me say this before, was that Iran would eventually do this. You can imagine if the desalination plants for Dubai were blown up, destroyed in large part or whole, all of a sudden you'd have this very large urban population, and where do they go? There aren't enough reverse osmosis purification units, ROPUs, in the region that can be brought in to make up for this shortfall. So what do? And you end up with this massive humanitarian crisis, etc. So this is significant. It is a big change in the war. It's a big change in the political calculus of these Gulf states. Now you're seeing Iran going for stuff which honestly gets into that existential, which is can my big city in my emirate, can my big city function if they keep doing what they're doing? And at that point, I'm looking at all of these warplanes that I've bought from the West, all these pilots that the Americans have trained, and I'm saying it might be time to do something. So I just want to bring that out. Separately, the U.S. has struck bridges, energy infrastructure in and around this big Bandar Abbas port facility in southern Iran. So you're seeing a lot of stuff that's happening that with going after not just the direct means of attack against U.S. bases in the Gulf and against our Gulf allies, but also going against also attacks of those things that logistically feed in to those areas where they can launch that stuff. So you can't send a replacement coastal radar by truck into Bandar Abbas for shipment over to Keshem if you can't get it there by rail or by road. And so that's some of the stuff you're seeing happening there. The president has threatened to strike more power plants and potentially hit desalination plants throughout Iran. They too have this problem. If you go to throughout Iran, particularly on the Persian Gulf, they have a need for desalination. Now they have larger mountains, so they have a little bit more fresh water that comes in from non-desalination means, but they too, in many areas, are very dependent on desalination plants for a large part of their potable water. The U.S. has moved in a bunch of, at least by reports, a bunch of aerial refueling planes, which opens up back into the region, I should mention, that indicates that we may be looking at bringing in other aircraft. And that other aircraft I look at is something you saw earlier in the war, which is big bombers. And we were using B-1 bombers, B-52 bombers. Of course, if you remember back in June of 2025, we had that famous strike with B-2 bombers. All of those are aircraft where you want to have a lot more aerial refueling capability. Hence, we're seeing aerial refueling. I'm not saying it's a strict indicator, but I would say it's an indicator we have to look at. And that would also tell me that we're looking at larger kinetic operations. I don't know exactly where, but I can think of some places where these kinetic operations would take place. So what does this mean? It means that strikes are going to hit a lot closer to home for Iranians and for the residents that are there, a lot closer to home across the entire region. And with Iran hitting the Gulf states, there's going to be growing pressure, particularly if they're taking out critical infrastructure that the population needs. There's going to be growing pressure to use their own militaries to help resolve this war faster, quicker. And they have a lot of capabilities there. I think Saudi Arabia, for example, has, I want to say, 230 plus strike aircraft they can use. If you get down to the UAE, I think maybe it's closer to 90 or something. But you start looking at these different countries, and on an aircraft carrier sitting off the coast like the Lincoln, we may have 60 or 70 strike aircraft. Now, we can do a quick sortie rate, although keep in mind, they're landing on a platform at sea, so it's relatively quick the way we do it, but you can only be so quick if you're on a platform because there's a lot of stuff that goes into recovering the aircraft and then launching them again, things like that. They have actual airfields where they can land on a runway and come in, get new bombs, head right out. And they have a lot of capabilities there. So you're looking at a country like the UAE can basically replicate more planes in terms of doing strike missions than we have on an aircraft carrier. That's a significant capability. If you're looking at a country like Saudi Arabia, they can replicate what we have on an aircraft carrier by 3 or 4 times, depending on how you want to look at that. That's a lot. And even smaller countries like Bahrain, Qatar have significant amounts of aircraft, Kuwait. So when you look at that, you could see where if they decide to join in on these strike missions, they could prosecute a lot of targets a lot faster, and that would greatly debilitate Iran's ability to launch strikes against these countries, against their critical infrastructure, particularly as Iran has decided that they are going to basically, in so many words, ignore these red lines. And I would say hitting desalination plants is one of those red lines. So it's a lot of stuff that could be brought away, all right? And Iran's current methodology is basically stripping away the reticence of these Gulf states to get more aggressively involved in not just defending against Iranian strikes, but actually counter strikes against Iran. Also, that's the overt side. Keep in mind, all of these countries watch. If I'm in Saudi Arabia, the number one country I'm watching for, I know you say, Israel. No, not actually. Actually, the number one country they're focused on from an intelligence standpoint, the big threat for them has always been Iran. They've been watching Iran extremely close, at least since 1979. That's been the big threat to Saudi Arabia. So and the same is kind of true for a lot of these other countries in the Gulf as well. They're to look there. So there's a lot of capabilities they have to do things on the covert side that maybe have not been fully employed as of yet. And you could end up seeing some things that could get interesting. I would not be surprised once the genie's out of the bottle, so to speak, in terms of, that is a really regional thing. I take that back. That's a horrible thing I just said, because that really is something that comes actually from the Middle East. Anyway, I won't get into it. But once that line has been crossed where they're actually doing that overtly, I think the covert line could definitely get crossed as well, and you could see action by these countries, probably working in cooperation with each other, maybe working in cooperation with the United States. I could see a variety of different things where this happens, where some things happen within the country that are not quite so apparent until something suddenly changes. I would also mention that Abu Musa, the islands when you go from the Persian Gulf to the Strait of Hormuz, you go past some islands. Abu Musa, Greater Tomb, and Lesser Tomb are 3 of those key islands. Those are islands that were actually controlled by the Emirates. Now, before it was the United Arab Emirates, they were just Emirates, and they actually controlled those islands. In 1971, just prior to the United Arab Emirates being stood up as the UAE, the Shah of Iran went in and militarily took those islands, and he's held on to them. He held on to them ever since. And then when the current regime came into power in 79, they've held on to them ever since. Certainly on Abu Musa, but also on Greater Tomb, the Revolutionary Guard Corps has put military assets in, stuff that they use to do attacks and support military operations for the regime throughout the Strait, throughout the Persian Gulf. So they are there. A lot of places to hit, and the U.S. has been doing strikes very recently on Abu Musa and Greater Tomb. Probably not as much to hit on Lesser Tomb. It's not much of an island, but these are 3 islands that the UAE actually claims as sovereign territory of the UAE. They've just never been in a position, till maybe now, to do anything about it. So you have the prospect, as you're seeing Iranian military assets across the region, certainly across the Strait, being hit with these big attacks. And if the Gulf states were to move from a defensive to more of an offensive stance with using their military, I'm looking at those three islands and I'm wondering if the UAE may seize the opportunity to try and reclaim some territory. I don't see why they wouldn't. Could be done in cooperation with the U.S. We certainly have the lift assets. We have the amphibious assault assets that could get their forces in there faster, quicker, better, that could take these islands. And more importantly, once they've been taken, it gives the U.S. the ability to pull out and just leave them with the UAE as an occupation force, so we don't have to tie up our forces occupying these islands or defending these islands. So that's a real distinct possibility, and that would change things. Politically, that would change things in Iran, because at that point, what the Revolutionary Guard Corps has been doing will have resulted in Iran losing territory. That would be the first thing you'd see there, and that would be significant. That would have political stock, if you will. All right. Control of these islands would also become a big operational challenge to the Revolutionary Guard Corps, because these islands are where they are in terms of geography. So it makes it much more difficult for the Revolutionary Guard Corps to operate, certainly in that part of the Strait of Hormuz, with complete autonomy, because these islands could be places where IRGC assets could be taken under fire. You could see air defense assets going on these islands, which could intercept drones and missiles coming over from Iran. There's just a lot of possibilities of what could happen. It could also be exacerbated if the U.S. was to then turn around to look at a couple of other islands, Lorak Island and Hormuz, which are much closer to Bandar Abbas, much closer to Keshem Island, much bigger islands, larger populations. But I could see something where once those islands are seized, you could see a statement by the U.S. with other Gulf states saying Iranian civilians on these islands, these other two islands, need to leave, that we cannot guarantee their safety after the next 24 hours or something like that. I think just saying that from a narrative standpoint, from a strategic communication standpoint, would certainly have tremendous impact on the psyches of not only those who are there directly affected, but also on everyone along there saying, hey, things are happening here, and we just saw those three islands out there get taken over by the UAE, and maybe with the help of the U.S. or whatever. I think it could really shift the momentum of this fight. And certainly if I was in Tehran and I was looking at ways to wedge things against the regime, I might take heart in this and use that momentum in any way I could. Also, the U.S. has been widening its strikes against the Bandar Abbas region, along with the naval port facility, basically cutting off all those major supply routes to go into it. So all of this has a cumulative mass. So it appears that the war is entering a new phase, a particularly dangerous phase. And to paraphrase Winston Churchill, it may not be the beginning of the end, but it most definitely is the end of the beginning. This is a big shift that's taken place. So I think we need to focus on this in a different way. I think we need to pay particular attention if we see the Gulf states jump in and start doing airstrikes or other types of activity. I think there's the possibility of this changing. And with all that said, I could be completely wrong. There could be something else going on right now that I'm just not seeing, where there's an off-ramp that I'm not aware of. But what I'm seeing is there's a big schism in Tehran between the elected leadership, the president, the foreign minister, the head of the legislative branch, all of whom, with the foreign minister and the head of the legislative branch, that's Galibaf and Araghchi, that they are being pushed aside by this hardliner Revolutionary Guard Corps group. And whereas that may feel good to the Revolutionary Guard Corps group, it certainly undermines the legitimacy of the government in the eyes of many, perhaps the vast majority of Iranian citizens. And with all these other factors kicking in, it's like anything else. It's rarely one thing. It's usually a series of cascading events and a lot of connected things that happen, and that's what usually predicates huge change. Thanks for listening to STRAT, and also please visit stratpodcast.com. You can also go to my YouTube channel, Hal Kempfer TV, where you can see a lot of the media things that I do. And you can always go to my website at www.gripsa.com. That's for Global Risk Intelligence Planning. And you can also go to the Los Angeles InfraGard website, where you might be able to catch the tail end of the gray zone that's dealing with sort of asymmetric warfare, hybrid warfare things, the gray zone webinar, and it's being offered in Encore edition, so you might be able to get a chance to catch that. I think that goes off pretty soon, but you might catch it this weekend. So anyway, thanks again, and hope you tune in for the next one.